I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Amber Duke.
I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Inez Stepman.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, today we got plenty to talk about. First, Amber's going to talk about Tim Walz being picked as the vice presidential candidate for Kamala Harris. Inez is going to talk about Google losing a major antitrust case in DC. Ben is going to talk about the censorship regime being reloaded. And finally, I'm going to talk about the riots going on in the United Kingdom. So kick it off. Let's go straight to Amber.
Absolutely. So Kamala Harris has indeed chosen Minnesota Governor Tim Walz to be her running mate in the 2024 presidential election. The final two picks supposedly came down to Walz and Josh Shapiro, the Pennsylvania governor, but he had some baggage for the progressive base of the Democrats in that he was too vocally pro-Israel, which is actually fascinating because if you look at Tim Walz's record on Israel, he has said a lot of the same things, has been AIPAC endorsed as Josh Shapiro, but those haven't been as heavily focused on as they had been for the Pennsylvania governor. Josh Shapiro was also hit with some oppo dumps on a sexual harassment scandal that took place in his office, as well as a case involving his time in the Attorney General's office, where they had held up a ruling of a suicide on a young woman who had been stabbed repeatedly in the head, in the back, but the main suspect was a friend of the Shapiros. So there was a lot of oppo dumping happening against Shapiro. Tim Walz gets chosen on Tuesday, and everyone on the left is celebrating this because he is perceived as being very pro-labor, very pro-working class. He comes from a sort of humble background. He was a school teacher. He served in the Army National Guard and is in a viable swing state that is probably going to go blue anyway. I don't think Trump really had a shot at Minnesota at this point, but he could potentially help the Democrats in Michigan and Wisconsin. However, Tim Walz is incredibly progressive, as much as the left has tried to prop him up as this sort of middle class, middle of the road, moderate blue dog Democrat. He is actually very far left with a lot of his policies. And when Minnesota in 2022 had a full sweep of the state legislature and the governor's mansion, they enacted a whole lot of very unpopular policies. He is very pro both legal and illegal immigration. He's pro sanctuary state and city. He wants to give health care and free college tuition to illegal immigrants. He has scoffed at the idea of a border wall, which just based on basic DHS numbers does reduce illegal crossings, and has advocated for that disastrous bipartisan border bill that we've dissected numerous times on this program. He has said that to him, socialism is just being friendly to your neighbor. One person's socialism is another person's neighborliness, he has said. He is for universal health care and getting rid of private insurance entirely, is very radical on abortion. The list really goes on. So I will kick it over to you all, but I tend to think that as much as he is pro-union and ostensibly pro-labor, so many of his other policies wipe out potential gains for the American working class, particularly immigration, as we've seen over the past year that native-born jobs have decreased while foreign-born jobs in the U.S. has increased rather significantly. This is possibly the worst time, with economy and immigration being the top two issues for voters, for Kamala to pick someone who is very aligned with her on all of those issues that have been affecting those jobs numbers.
Yeah, I think it's Make America Great Again versus Make America Burn Again. That's I think the basic way to sum up what the race is about now. I mean, everybody's pointing out Tim Walz was the guy who let Minneapolis burn in 2020, and Kamala Harris was the person who bailed out the arsonists. So, it really crystallizes things. I think this is a major mistake from Kamala Harris, because I think that her weakest point, and from what I know from like focus groups and testing, from what I've heard, her weakest point is actually the defund the police, abolish ICE, pro bailing out rioters stuff. That's the stuff that moderates have no time for. And by picking Walz, she's actually made it a natural theme of the campaign now, like, because it's both parts of the ticket are responsible for what happened in Minneapolis, and that city burned to the ground. I think that in other ways, Waltz is terrible. I mean, he's on policy. He's a far left guy on trans issues too. This is a guy who insisted that, like tampons be put in boys' bathrooms, suggested that parents who do not acknowledge their child's transition could have their child taken away from them. So hard left on that stuff.
And signed a bill, by the way, if I can, just also sign a bill making Minnesota a trans refuge state for people to get quote unquote gender affirming care.
Yeah. So, whatever benefits
people,
he
minors.
Provides.
That's right. Minors. Thank you. Exactly.
Minors, we're talking, this is the,
I mean, I'm against both, to be clear, but it's even more extreme when you're talking about trafficking kids across state lines for these procedures. Right. Anyway,
so this is as good. I think this is as good a pick as for Republicans as it could be. Josh Shapiro would have been much more of a problem, and we could talk about the whole dynamic about how really the problem with Josh Shapiro for Kamala Harris is that he's Jewish, and there's a great video of who's his face, Jamal Bowman, cheering. He didn't say this, but really he's cheering the Judenfrei nature of the Democratic ticket.
But by the way, one of the reasons that it is the Jewish thing and not even his positions is that Shapiro has been out there bashing Bibi Netanyahu months back. He, of course, also himself basically tried to run from anything in his past linking him to Jewish causes or Zionist causes, and they still wouldn't pick him at the end of the day. Van Jones said the quote of all quotes on this. I don't know why he said it, but I think it's because he knows it to be true in his heart of hearts. And maybe it was a slip of the tongue, but his direct quote was that anti-Semitism has been, quote, marbled into the Democrat Party. That tells you everything you need to know. And so, on the one hand, we can talk about, I feel personally vindicated because I wrote a book 4 years ago on how Ilhan Omar was the future, if not the present, of the Democrat Party. And I think today's decision has crystallized that fact, and everyone can see it for what it is now. The interesting thing is, well, first at a macro level, both the Republican and Democrat tickets both did not choose a mushy middle figure for VP. So Kamala picked someone who I guess ostensibly can make her look relatively less crazy and radical. And obviously, J.D. Vance looks like a nationalist, populist, conservative standard bearer. So that's kind of interesting. And the question is, from the Democrat side, was the calculation that basically the pro-Hamas and progressive voters needed Waltz to come out? Or is the view on the Democrat side that they can win with a far left ticket on paper and in reality, and that basically they don't need to tack to the middle? They don't need to make even a show of going for normie voters or independent voters or even just traditional liberal voters. Do they think that Waltz's Minnesota nice veneer is enough to cover that? Or is the objective basically and the thought that all they need to do is to juice the progressive vote, or that they can just win, period, full stop, and they have so mastered and dominated the system that they could put anyone as the number 2 on that ticket and it wouldn't matter? And I don't know. Maybe you guys have a sense based upon the polling, anecdotal evidence, et cetera. But the scary thing to me about this pick is that while on paper it looks like a dumb pick, bluntly, for Democrats, they're politically shrewd. They're not dumb. So do they think this doesn't hurt them and that they can win with anyone as the number 2?
I did see a tweet from Sagar and Jetty that I thought was a really interesting take, which is that the Tim Walz pick for Kamala is not to try to win back Rust Belt states, but to win Sun Belt states where you have suburban white women who want the pretense of voting for a progressive Black woman, blue dog Democrat, white guy ticket. And this sort of gives them the cover to pretend like they're being pro-working class and makes them feel better about the whole thing, which I thought was really fascinating.
So a few things. I said when J.D. Vance was picked, that I don't believe in the idea that VP picks really swing the election anymore. I think our issues and divisions are truly national in that sense. And so I would be very surprised if this does anything but on the barest of margins change the election fortunes. That being said, I think those picks do show a lot about the internal dynamics of each one of the parties. And that's what the pick of J.D. Vance shows. That shows that there is a future for a post-Trump Republican Party, and that future is probably more national populist than the Republican Party before it. And similarly here, I think that it shows something we already knew, which is that despite his demographic veneer, Waltz is basically the squad pick, right? And that is the future of the Democratic Party. A couple people I think have mentioned something. My husband has also been tweeting and writing about this, but I do think this is, to the extent that there is an inter-party benefit or intra-party benefit to this, it's to tamp down the craziness of the convention, right? If she throws a bone to the sort of Democratic rioting marchers who are the pro-Hamas wing of the party, then she stands a chance of coming out of the convention with a bump instead of a bunch of stories about, lawless behavior and rioting at the convention and internal chaos. And I think that probably factored into the decision. That being said, Waltz actually fits the Democratic base and their views and the future of the party better than Shapiro does. To my mind, Shapiro was a good pick for the Dems in terms of me not wanting them to win, right? But putting forward a strong foot, exactly, because it's not just about Israel-Palestine. On a whole host of issues, he actually is, or at least can pull off the veneer of being more of a blue dog, moderate Democrat. And it seems like Kamala's strategy, and Will mentioned this in the outset, is to run away from the position she's taken in 2020. And I think to the extent that this pick matters, it matters only because it makes it harder for Kamala to run away from the things she herself did and said in 2020, not just about the Floyd riots, but about like a whole host of cultural issues, where her strategy seems to be, of course, helped by a compliant media, to ignore that she ever said any of those things, that she ever held any of those positions. I mean, on things that are as easily checkable as like fracking, right? To blanket out anything she said before. And I think picking Tim Waltz makes that harder for her to do that. And to that extent, I think it's a more difficult pick, but I don't think it's going to swing the election. I think the election is still going to be about Trump versus Kamala, and it's not going to be about JD Vance and his comments, and it's not going to be about Waltz and his extremism. I think our politics are national in that way. And I don't think VP picks have the same regional and geographic salience that they once did. And I don't know. I know I'm sort of on a limb in that. Every time I bring that up on like one of these shows, and people really disagree with me, and we all like to talk about who the VP picks are. But I really do think they're quite marginal at the end of the day, except if there is a victory for either team after the election. I do think it matters that you have a hard left VP. He's going to ensure that the Kamala Harris administration governs in line with what she said in 2020 and what his entire career is about, right? So in that sense, it matters enormously.
Time to move on. It's your turn to move on to the Google antitrust case.
So there is this antitrust case. Google loses an antitrust case, which is a big deal. So I guess I'll just set up the discussion. I think there are a lot of components to this. The three major parts legally are defining what the marketplace looks like, whether or not Google has a type of monopoly on advertising, looking at its exclusionary agreements and default settings. It looks a lot to me kind of like Microsoft being broken up. In the early 2000s. And but I think we would all agree that there are larger issues at stake here, which is generally the power of some of these large tech companies, their ability to control search results, their ability to control the flow of information, and then the inability of customers in the case of antitrust specifically, what actual realistic ability customers have to avoid a particular company, right? Like Google, when they're choosing what browser to use, right? What search engine to use, what default settings on their phones. Sometimes they literally can't choose those things, and it's impossible to change them in some cases. But sometimes it's just really difficult, right? And whether or not our law is going to reflect the fact that you need to buy a new $1,400 phone in order to get rid of something, right? I think generally this is a positive step. It is a further advancement of a kind of overlap that we've seen happen, a kind of bipartisan overlap that we've seen happen between some Republicans and some Democrats, still with many different ideas on the details, but generally an agreement forming that there is a really good reason to look at the extension of tech company power, to worry about the way in which that power is sort of applied within the market, and to think about the political implications, especially on the right, of those things. So I'll just, with that, I'll just, throw it out to the group. I know you must have thoughts on this. It has obviously clear implications for censorship issues and the ability of a single company or even a handful of companies to censor. If you have that kind of market dominance, it's very, very difficult. And especially if you hold that kind of market dominance in a breaking point, or like a bottleneck in the market where we saw, this is a different company and a different issue, but I think it's sort of similar in terms of the structural and legal issues involved. Like we saw with the hosting, Apple hosting on app downloads, right? Where they were able to kick Parler off of app downloads and then basically kick them out of the market. We've seen those kinds of fulcrums be used by these major tech companies to enforce their ideological views about what should and shouldn't be seen on the digital marketplace or public square. So anyway, I think this is really interesting. I think it's interesting that Google couldn't stop this from coming together in Washington as well, and really miss Rachel Bovard for these discussions. Because I think her commentary is really probably the one to read on these, but I know you guys must have thoughts as well. So,
yeah. So I guess, I mean, obviously this is a huge victory for the forces fighting against these internet monopolies. I think it has to be, it's a very, very positive outcome. And I think something to really notice is, I don't know if you all noticed this, Google really is not very good as a search engine anymore. That's something that I noticed when I switched to DuckDuckGo. Google is actually just bad. Like if you search for something, you get ad, and then finally, after a while, you might actually get some of the results you're looking for. That's a function of their monopoly. They used to be, I remember in like the early 2000s, mid 2000s, they were the best search engine. The results were way, way better than Yahoo, way better than the other, primitive search engines that were available at the time. And because of that, they built this sort of default monopoly. They established themselves as like the only search engine that's the default on smartphones. They own Android and they have a contract with Apple, so they're the default. And they've exploited that to become just a terrible search engine that doesn't actually give you the information you want when you want it. And so if there is sort of this basic case for antitrust, and I, libertarians, I remember you probably all grew up with this stuff if you were a young right winger and you were sort of brought up and went to conferences and educational, forums and seminars, you got told, oh, antitrust is stupid. They're wrong. There's always the shadow of competition, so it can't possibly help. And it's like, I look back on that stuff. It's like, yeah, that was monopolists talking so they could keep their monopoly and persuade young right wingers to help them keep their monopoly. It's like, no, actually, Google sucks because it is a monopoly, and it's probably a good thing that government does something about it, even external to all the nefarious stuff Google does to the right more broadly.
Right. And I'd like to touch a little bit on how this affects the media landscape, because when you search for any story that is, I mean, really any story, let's just start there from a general perspective. If you search for a news story, even if you don't go to the news tab, but it's worse if you go to the news tab of Google search, you will not get a conservative media outlet or even an independent media outlet that's not one of the big corporations until probably page 3. And you certainly won't get one in the top little featured section under the news tab where they feed you what the biggest and best stories are. Then if you search for a potentially damaging story on any of the Democrats or liberals, the problem appears to be even worse. I mean, even with just the Josh Shapiro accusations that I referenced earlier in regards to the alleged cover-up of sexual harassment that took place in his office, when you search for that on Google, the first 5 or 6 results that you get are from mainstream media outlets, mostly big corporations, that are downplaying the accusations and actually don't explain them in very good detail at all. And you won't get even Fox News or New York Post or a conservative big corporation media outlet until probably the second page. You won't get any actually conservative media outlets, I would say, until you get to page 3 or 4 that explain things in any depth. And this is consistent across the board, where negative information about the left is buried under the Google search engine. And even any information that comes from a conservative outlet never gets prominence on that search engine. So for people to consume conservative and independent media content, they have to basically go directly to the home pages of those outlets, or they have to find it on X or some other less biased social media platform, sometimes Facebook, because they actually follow or subscribe to those outlets' pages on Facebook in order to get to any articles on there. So this has been basically a thorn in the side of the news business in general for the past 5 to 10 years, because they have not only used their monopoly to sell you ads, to tamp down negative information, but they have pretty much single-handedly helped prop up this fake media landscape and ecosystem that has tried to prevent challengers. So it's not just a search engine monopoly, it's also just an information and media monopoly as well. Because I guarantee that the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, NBC News, Associated Press will lose a significant amount of power, a significant amount of the ability to sell ads, of traffic, if they were not ranked number 1 through 5 every single time you search for something on Google.
Just to interject one sentence here, the most obvious example recently was, of course, searching for the Trump assassination attempt, where it would not prompt you to put in, when you wrote in Trump assassination, it wouldn't prompt you, and it wouldn't show you like in the top results. And they had some explanation for why that was so. That was completely unbelievable. Like they're trying to prevent people from searching for political violence, right? I think the thing that popped up first was like Lincoln assassination when you put in. Anyway, so that was the most recent obvious example of that kind of bias.
Yeah, and I'm going to talk about that when I kick off the next segment. Before we get there, yeah, just to briefly echo Amber's comments, I mean, I think we ought to think about the legacy and corporate media companies plus the social media platforms and big tech companies as the controlling institutions over the information sphere. And the whole objective is to monopolize narrative, to monopolize power. And that means propagate the information and opinions that the regime wants out there, suppress competing ones. It serves the business models of all of the incumbent players by destroying the competition. And obviously also it leads to control over the American mind. And that is how these platforms, unfortunately, ought to be understood, as rather than, basically engines for knowledge, dissemination and distribution, and actually hashing out opinions and debates so that the best answer can win at the end of the day. Unfortunately, it's the perverse opposite of that. And then when you layer on, of course, the surveillance implications to it as well, it's incredibly disturbing. And to that end, the big question at the end of this is, it's great, obviously, that a federal judge who is on the other side on a lot of other issues that we care about, by the way, came to the conclusion that Google is a monopolist. However, there's no aspect of the ruling that deals with the remedies. And there's going to be appeals on the ruling, and there's going to be a separate case that deals with the remedies. And that is really going to be where the rubber hits the road. And it's going to take time to get there. So we'll see ultimately how that plays out. But it is worth noting, now that there has been some legal blood drawn, is this going to impact at all other players in the big tech space? Is this simply going to lead to them engaging in more campaign funding and lobbying? Is there going to be an appetite for more legislative efforts to go at the sort of issues that the antitrust enforcement here pointed to? all open questions that I guess we'll see how they're addressed in the months to come. But this is one interesting area where there is overlap between the two parties, I think, for the common good.
All right. Pivoting right back to you, Ben, and censorship.
Yep. So I'll kick off with sort of the micro and the macro of how I think the censorship regime is re-engaging this cycle. So to Inez's point, the House Judiciary Committee sent a bunch of questions out to Google/Alphabet regarding autocomplete and some of the other functions, and has posted those responses in their correspondence with the company, which was very telling. So first, the House Judiciary Committee did bring up the whole autocomplete feature not populating with Trump assassination attempt, even though according to Google, it should have. Supposedly, Google says this is because its autocomplete built-in protections around political violence were quote unquote out of date. Google also admitted to the House Judiciary Committee in correspondence they just put out that autocomplete was not showing Trump's name in response to searches for quote unquote President Donald and similar terms. Supposedly, this was because of a bug later fixed by an update. And then Google also tried to explain why Google searches for Trump return news labels and stories about Kamala Harris. And I'm quoting from the report here. Alphabet claimed that this error was the result of its algorithm that automatically generates and displays labels about news topics related to a Google search inquiry. The company also noted that, quote, predictions may be unexpected or imperfect, and bugs will occur. So obviously it's fascinating how the bugs always seem to go one way. The updates only seem to implicate themes and information that might be derogatory to the regime. And obviously Google, of course, as we just noted, has outsized influence as a monopolist in search and also in how they surface news stories to people. So obviously the implications of this are potentially massive. We're just looking at a few different themes here, Trump-related themes, but one can imagine on all things pertaining to the election, how much Google has its thumb on the scale. But I also want to go to another development that's gotten less focus that I think ought to concern all of us and was predictable, and in fact predicted by Justice Alito in his dissenting opinion with respect to Murthy v. Missouri. So the DOJ recently put out an IG report that hasn't gotten a lot of notice towards the end of July. And the IG was basically looking into efforts of DOJ sub-entities to deal with foreign influence, information operations and the like regarding threats to U.S. elections. And of course, this was the key vector for the censorship regime to engage in 2020. It was purportedly foreign influence threats that were used to justify colluding and coordinating with and leaning on social media companies directly and by proxy to censor Americans, first with respect to the Hunter Biden laptop story, and then much more broadly with respect to all things related to election integrity and outcomes, regardless of whether the information came from U.S. sources or was attributed to foreign adversaries. So the DOJ responded to the IG's report with a memo included in it. And what they laid out there was that they codified essentially their mechanisms for justifying continued engagement with social media companies around protected speech in 2024. A few things that they point out in their own memo. They say that the FBI is now required to identify, quote, specific, credible, and articulable facts that provide high confidence for assessing that the information at issue relates to activity attributable to a foreign government, foreign non-state actor, or their proxy engaged in an FMI, foreign malign influence operation. So trust them on their attribution. They also require the FBI now to include a disclaimer explaining that it, quote, does not request or expect recipients to take any specific action based on shared information. That is to jump when authorities say how high about censorship requests. Also, the report says that the DOJ has already or intends to begin re-engaging with social media companies. There are going to be senior officials going around to key stakeholders around quote unquote election threats. Basically, they're getting the entire band back together with the same censorship activities, with the same personnel they engaged in last time. But they want us to believe that this time they're going to be super serious about ensuring that American speech isn't caught in the dragnet of censorship requests, and that all of this behavior, all of this conduct is passive and it's advisory and it's above board. So this to me is a massive red flag. It's a clear consequence of the Murthy decision that the FBI feels it can act with reckless abandon, even though they're going to have these sort of procedures, standard operating procedures now that codify it and try to legitimize their efforts. So I guess the question is, what do you make of these developments, and how substantial or how impactful do you think regime control over information is going to be in the 2024 race versus the 2020 race?
So, first of all, I think you're exactly right to say this is a consequence of essentially the law and the courts not recognizing the reality. We're not going to build or be able to build the kind of evidentiary record, even that was the basis for the Murthy case, ever again. Right? They're going to put a little disclaimer at the bottom, or they're going to do it in person or over the phone in a way that it's not recorded. But you don't need to be that explicit when you're a federal agency going to a private company and saying, here are the people I want you to censor. You don't have to be as explicit even as they were in Murthy, right? So the ability that all of us who are concerned about this and the law firms that are working on this to collect a kind of evidentiary record of this kind of influence is we already had our shot. It's not going to get any better than it was. In fact, it's going to get worse because people, these are intelligent actors. They're not, your random criminal on the street. They are intelligent actors, and they're going to find a way to do it that skirts the ability to collect the evidentiary record of that kind of undue influence, right? So, this was a big whiff by the court. I think there are going to be massive consequences to it. The only counterbalancing fact I have, which, look, I don't like to rely on our billionaire versus their billionaire, but it does change the landscape to have one major social media company, by which I mean X, that isn't going to be censoring these kinds of stories. Because a lot of the power in the 2020 election came from the fact that if you're banned from one of these social platforms, you're going to get banned from all of them. They weren't coordinating perhaps in fact, but they were coordinating in the more basic sense that the people who ran these companies and the people who staffed them all had the same basic worldview and found the same things beyond the pale, whether they were being influenced by government to do that or not. And that coordination, that cultural collusion, if you will, had enormous power, that even breaking out one major social company from that, and we can't rely as a permanent solution for Elon Musk to just swoop in and buy out one of these coordinating companies every time. It's not like a larger solution to the policy problem and the legal problem. But in terms of the upcoming election, I think of it as, I do think of us as having at least a somewhat better position than we did in 2020 by virtue of the fact of having even one company that isn't censoring stories and news items that are favorable to the right.
Well, and I think if he was going to buy any of them, X is the most strategically important because it is the one where more and more Americans are getting their news. This is the percentage of people who get their news from Twitter/X has grown precipitously in the past 3 to 4 years. It has mostly overtaken Facebook as the primary social media platform where people get their news. It's basically X and TikTok now. So if he was going to buy any social media platform, obviously wasn't capable of buying TikTok because the Chinese just won't let that be pried from their cold dead hands, then X was definitely the one to have the biggest impact.
Yeah, I think that that's the general answer. They won't be able to ramp up a censorship in the same way because they don't control Twitter and they don't control Elon. And I remember thinking, I think I said this publicly in 2022, that it was a far bigger victory that Elon ultimately ended up purchasing X than a loss than we lost those midterms, and that the long-term effects of that would be dramatic. In reality, my big shtick, if I had a big political shtick from like 2017 to 2022, it was internet censorship and free speech online and ending and everybody having a free platform to civil rights. Elon Musk in one swoop basically solved that problem. Now it may not be permanently solved because what happens if he's gone, God forbid, but for now he basically solved that problem. So I'm just thankful the guy bought Twitter. It's not the free market at work. It's just Deus Ex Machina. The richest guy in the world decided to buy the single most important social media platform, and suddenly our guy is now in charge of it instead of anybody else. And with that, I guess we'll just pivot over to my topic, unless there's somebody who wants to talk about more. We got a little more time on this segment. Anybody wants to? Okay. My topic is the UK riots. So there was a murder in Southport. I think the child of a Rwandan immigrant, somebody apparently who was involved in the regime actually was this immigrant. Their son murdered 3 children in Southport, England. And this was the catalyst for riots all over the country, places like Sunderland, elsewhere, Rotherham. And it led to Keir Starmer coming out and giving an excoriating speech that sounded like the most Law and Order speech I've ever heard. And I've actually, like, after NatCon, I met with a few British influencers. I follow British politics pretty closely, and in general, the British right seems to be saying kind of the stuff like, well, what do you expect? Mass immigration is terrible. And I sympathize with that view in the sense that it's pretty clear that, the British people, and especially the British right, has been repeatedly voting for immigration restriction for well over a decade, and the governments they elect refuse to deliver it. You can look at the Brexit vote as essentially a referendum on further illegal migration, electing the Conservatives with a massive majority under Boris Johnson to get Brexit done. You name it. And the Conservative Party repeatedly just did the opposite. I mean, talk about a party that totally betrayed its voters. I think we talked about this a month ago when the British election was going on, and Nigel Farage got a big chunk of the vote. But I mean, the Conservative Party is basically dead. Now, the problem, as I see it, is that Labour did win this election. They, with 33% of the vote, but they won something like 2/3 of the seats in Parliament. Conservatives got destroyed, and they're in a position to kind of do what they want. And Keir Starmer's at the very beginning of his term, so he's at the peak of his powers. And so these riots, I don't see them accomplishing very much, other than this looks like January 6th redux to me. A situation where all these rioters are going to find themselves arrested and bankrupted by a state that is at the height of its powers. I think I wrote a lengthier post on Twitter where I basically explained, like, unless these people intend to coup Starmer and actually install a new government, all your riots are going to do is just bad things for you. And I don't think that anything productive is really going to come from them. I mean, I'm sad because I think that, the British people have a right to their own country, and they're getting overwhelmed by mass immigration. And both of the major parties couldn't care less about stopping it or ensuring law and order in the country more broadly. But and so that's kind of depressing. But I can't imagine these riots are the right way to go about things, and that they're going to do anything other than hurt the people who engage in them. So I'm curious about what your thoughts are.
Well, so I try not to comment on other countries' politics because I feel so underqualified to do so. You obviously follow their politics a lot better than I do. But I do want to draw a few parallels to the US. The first is the explanation for the anger, leaving aside the decision to break the law, which I don't support riots, and I don't support the decision to, burn buildings as a political response. But the explanation for the anger that's clearly that people predicted. It was clearly predictable because people predicted it. A lot of people predicted it. The explanation is essentially acts of mass hypnotism. And that sounds a lot to me like the media landscape that we've been living in since 2015, and Donald Trump's surge, right, and eventually victory in the 2016 election, which is that people are angry because somebody is spinning a watch in front of their eyes, right? And the same when we saw when Tucker left Fox News, there was the same explanation, right? This kind of top-down explanation. People hear this politician say X, or they watch this TV show and it says this, and that's how they get these ideas. That's why they're angry. That's why they're quote unquote whipped up. When the reality is much more bottom up. These are issues that have gone unaddressed for decades in many cases, as Will pointed out, by both parties in the UK, certainly in the US. You can talk about immigration the same way as an issue that was not addressed by either party until Donald Trump, broke onto the political scene. So I just have this real, it's such an unhelpful way, even if one is sort of moderate or trying to sew a country back together in this kind of violence and division, it's so unhelpful because it avoids the truth of failure that results in that kind of mass anger. If otherwise law-abiding people are mass rioting in the streets, it might behoove you, and particularly the elites and decision makers in a country, to try to think and understand why that's happening, rather than to imagine that it's just because people are just so stupid that they hear a stray radio program and they start burning stuff, right? And so I think that's just a very unhelpful reflex. But it appears to be, when I saw the statement the prime minister made, it was basically that, right? It was like, this is an act of mass hypnotism. These people are whipped up by like my enemies, basically, right? And that is a very, very unhelpful frame to think about any of this. The second thing I would say is, thankfully, the US immigration problem until the last couple of years has not been on the level of what's happening in the UK, in part because of who exactly was coming here, right? Whatever cultural problems, and they are many, both legal and cultural problems that we've had from mass Mexican and Latin American immigration over the last 20 to 30 years over our southern border, we're not as far apart culturally from the people who are coming here. And in fact, in the West, there is like quite a bit of like cross-border history and so on between those peoples. Now, I'm not trying to downplay immigration as an issue in the United States. Obviously, it is very salient, and those consequences are very real in the United States, whether economic or cultural or otherwise. But it's not the same as having mass numbers of North African Muslims, for example, coming into the country. And increasingly, what makes me nervous is, if you look at the migration patterns on our southern border for the last couple years, as opposed to the slow-moving disaster of the last 30, right? Just the last couple years, it starts to look a lot more like the UK and a lot less like the economic migration, which, as I said, has all of its own problems, right? That has been coming to the US for the last 30 years. The people coming across the border now are from a very different set of countries. There was a report from Fox recently that was reporting on something the House had actually reported on, which is that 100 individuals from the terror watch list were released into the country by the Biden administration. Okay, so I think our immigration issue is going to get more dangerous, more explosive, as the types of people who are coming here are different and come from a very, very wildly different culture, even much further away from mainstream American culture than, say, like economic migrants from Mexico.
And I'd just like to underscore, Inez, what you were saying in terms of the narrative surrounding these riots and the complete misapplication of where the anger is coming from and why it exists. Because we saw the exact same reaction during the previous round of riots in Ireland, and the media headlines that have been fed to me across my various algorithms, whether it's search engines, social media, etc., all describe these as racist, far-right, anti-Muslim, bigoted, hate speech related riots. And of course, I'm with all of you. We do not condone violence or rioting, but we understand the sentiment behind why these people are behaving this way. And it's fundamentally about the fact that people don't like it when a group of foreigners comes in, takes their housing, takes their jobs, and then rapes or kills their children. I mean, that's just the crux of the issue. And the media and the politicians in the UK have been very intentionally trying to explain away or cover up the reasons why people are furious. And we see that reflected in the US media in response to our current border crisis as well. The refrain of, well, illegal immigrants commit less crime than native-born Americans, which is just fundamentally not true, for a variety of reasons that we could get into on this program, but would take a minute to explain. But it's based on basically a really flawed study. They say, well, actually, they're just doing the jobs that Americans won't do. And when we talk about the high-profile cases of young American women who have been raped and murdered by illegal immigrants, it's, well, that's just one anecdote. So these media narratives only further fuel the attitudes and behavior that they claim to despise, because they refuse to grapple with it seriously and offer any potential solutions for what's happening.
I'll just say briefly, it's remarkable that we always have the controlled experiment before us of Europe broadly, European insane progressive policies, the open border policies, importing people from hostile cultures, alien cultures en masse, the anti-free speech sentiments that pervade both the societies and then the laws that the societies pass. We have it all before us. We see what the consequences are, and yet still, at least the representatives of 50% of the country are dead set on aping those policies and producing the exact same results here. Now, we are blessed by the fact that we are surrounded by oceans, that we have not imported en masse those from the Islamic world to the same extent that Europe has done, and thus we don't have the same consequences yet. But directionally, we're still trotting the same path. And it's remarkable to me, the Western mind virus and this cycle of rise and fall, where societies repudiate all the things that made those societies into what they are. They pursue policies that they know are going to be absolutely destructive. And they think that it's virtuous and just and righteous to do it. And maybe it's all about a cynical power play, but if you're in the elites at the end of the day and you remain elite, but you have all of the consequences of these policies, is it really going to be a place you're going to want to live, where you have to live surrounded by gates with armed security and your cities have devolved into total crime, chaos, and filth, and your kids have no future? That's the world we're looking at. And all we have to do is look, we're about 10 years behind in perpetuity Europe for what is coming here, yet our elites seem hell-bent on rushing straight towards that bleak future.
All right. Well, with that, we'll pivot over to final thoughts. I got a final thought that was something earlier in the week, or last week rather, but that something that really did annoy me quite a bit. I think it was on Friday when this came out. Kyle Rittenhouse put out a statement at one point last week where he was saying that he was going to write in Ron Paul because he didn't think Donald Trump was good enough on gun control. And there were a decent number of like MAGA influencers who just went full attack on the guy, like said he was a traitor, a whole bunch of nonsense, basically made some claims that, how dare he, it was MAGA supporters who helped fund his legal defense. He should be absolutely loyal. Rittenhouse ultimately changed his mind, had a discussion with some people, and came back out and endorsed Trump after all this bullying. But that doesn't mean I excuse any of the bullying. I have absolutely no time for it. People need to, when it comes to Kyle Rittenhouse, that guy gets all the grace in the world because, the question was he a hero or a villain? And the answer he was a victim 3 times over. First off, he was a victim of a brutal assault by, essentially a massive mob full of criminals and pedophiles who were trying to kill him. As a 17-year-old kid. That's the first thing. If Tim Walz, well, actually, this is Wisconsin, so Tony Evers can take the blame. If Tony Evers had done his job, Kyle Rittenhouse wouldn't have been put in this position in the first place. Then he was the victim of a malicious prosecution by a bunch of liberals who should damn well have known better that this was very obviously self-defense, and the victim of an unbelievable media demonization campaign. And he went through all that at 17 years old. And so, you know what? If the kid wants to vote in Ron Paul because he cares about gun rights, which damn well he should, good for him. I mean, I'm voting for Donald Trump. I think everybody should vote for Donald Trump, but I'm not going to get on some kid because he has a different point of view, and especially a kid who went through some of the most undeserved trauma of anybody I know, anybody I've ever heard of, especially at his age. So people need to chill out. And those influencers who decided to go on the attack against him really should be ashamed of themselves.
So I just point to one insane story dealing with immigration, and then one slightly less insane resolution or partial resolution to another terrorism-related case. Last week, we got word that the 2 individuals who the government did everything possible to cover up their place of origin and other information about them, it was 2 Jordanian immigrants here illegally who had rammed into a truck at a Quantico Marine base. These individuals did go to court. However, they were let go We don't know about any potential terrorist ties to them, what they were doing at this Quantico base. But the information, the court filings, which the government hid, were dug up by the Center for Immigration Studies. Thank God they went and did the work to actually look into these individuals, but I think it remains an open and running scandal why the government has been withholding information on these cases and why these individuals weren't deported from the country immediately when they were threatening a military installation and all the other sketchy details that we have to date surrounding them. On a slightly less insane note, I think many Americans were outraged to find that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the 9/11 mastermind, and allegedly the murderer of journalist Daniel Pearl, achieved a plea deal alongside 2 other Guantanamo detainees. At last second, Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, called off those plea deals, essentially, seemingly unilaterally. You wonder if this was on the merits or the politics. It'd be fascinating to know, to the extent it was the politics. Was it that devastating for this administration for there to be plea deals cut with a mass murderer and other jihadis in Gitmo? I'm glad that those plea deals were nullified by Austin. We'll see ultimately how these cases are disposed of. It remains a scandal in some ways that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and these other jihadis are still on Earth and getting all the benefits of the kind of system that their countries of origin would never give to Americans in an equivalent situation. But nonetheless, I'm glad that today KSM does not have a plea deal.
Yeah, my final thought is about the 2 finalists for gold and silver in the Olympics in women's boxing, both being genetically male. And the sort of gaslighting that has been happening from the IOC and from various like sports governing commissions around these basic facts, which I think is worth bringing up exactly, not because this particular episode, although it's really obvious and it's one of those clarity moments where you see somebody who's obviously biologically male and has such a huge strength differential just take out women in a contact sport, right? Where the choice before women who have spent their entire lives training for this moment, right, is to essentially concede and save their health and potentially their lives from injury, or to try to go forward with it and really to risk very, very serious injury. Because I don't know if it's Hollywood movies or sort of feminist propaganda or what, but the average person, or maybe it's just that we're so disconnected from the physical in our day-to-day lives, so many of us, but it really seems like the average person very much downplays the size of the strength differential between men and women. It's not a matter of like training and strength. I mean, in many of these kinds of strength or sports competitions, you barely have any overlap on the tails, meaning the strongest women in the world, often in these kinds of competitions, can be taken out by, your average athletic high school boy, right? So there's barely any overlap on the tails. The strength differential is huge, and especially in contact sports, it's very dangerous for women. Not to mention, it's dangerous for us all to look at something like that and and pretend that we're not seeing what we're seeing, which is an obvious truth of the differences between men and women. But I think it's also relevant to bring up because so often, and I suspect we'll hear it more after these cases, even more than we have before, which is the answer when people get more blunt about saying, this is a man and this is a woman, that we get the pushback. No, it's actually a spectrum, because here are a series of essentially pathologies and disorders that are either on chromosomal abnormalities or result in certain kinds of hermaphrodism or certain kinds of medical pathologies that inhibit normal sex development. And that's apparently what these 2 men have, right? They have XY chromosomes, they have testes that produce testosterone, but they have ambiguous, probably especially when they were born, they have ambiguous genitalia because they have some kind of disorder, right, that prevents their sex characteristics from developing normally. First of all, that doesn't change the reality of their advantages that they're bringing into an athletics competition, right? But it does, I will admit that it should change how we talk about it, in the sense that there's a difference between somebody who identifies as the opposite sex on no biological basis whatsoever, and somebody who legitimately is suffering with a medical condition that probably, has caused a lot of pain in life. That being said, that's always the Mott and Bailey argument, right? Even in these individuals' cases, sex is still binary. They're still men, but they have a medical condition that prevents them from developing normally as men. There are corresponding, illnesses on the women's side. On the men's side, again, there's Klinefelter syndrome, which is XXY chromosomes, right? But these are a very small percentage of cases. They're going to be higher in athletic female competitions in the best of the world, exactly because having more genetic qualities or more biological qualities of men is a huge advantage in physical sports. But even those cases don't disprove the sex binary. They're medical pathologies that are preventing the normal development of either male or female in some of the like exterior characteristics that we recognize. But I just think it's really important for us to be clear about that stuff, not of course cruel, but clear, because there's so much confusion in the language, and it's all built in to the language and the way we talk about these things, that it is, and for political reasons, that I find it especially necessary to lay out this is a small percentage of cases. They don't disprove a sex binary. We're talking about a small percentage of people who suffer with a medical pathology. And actually, I find it quite cruel the way that, in this case, it was unavoidable, but in many other cases, it's not. It just gets pulled out by the left as a card. Like, I've often wondered what people with Klinefelters or something else have thought about being sort of the left's trump card that proves that, some guy who invented his identity in prison 3 months ago is now being transferred to the women's prison, right? Like, it is a very flippant way to use something that probably causes a lot of pain in this small percentage of people's lives. And I don't know. I just think it's worth clarifying.
I agree. It's been a heck of a week and a half trying to explain this to people, but I think the best comparison right now in terms of the Olympics for the competitive advantage that genetically or biologically male individuals have over women is that Katie Ledecky is very much considered one of the best, if not the best, female swimmers of all time. She holds the top 20 times in the women's 1500-meter freestyle, and yet her best time is still a full minute slower than the world record time for a male. But my final thought is on the current economic conditions. We just had the July jobs report come out showing that unemployment is up a full percentage point from where it was a year ago. We've seen that native-born jobs have decreased while foreign-born jobs have increased quite significantly. And the stock market this week has fallen pretty considerably. And I think we're at a point where all of the poor fundamentals of our economy have finally been caught up within the stock market and with the jobs numbers. Inflation and all of the spending that our government was doing was sort of a Band-Aid on a bullet hole for quite some time. And things have finally caught up to the fact that no, the economy is not good. What people have been feeling for the past 3 years is real. And unfortunately, in the short term, that's going to be very negative for a lot of people's retirement accounts and just their investments in general. Politically, it stands to be incredibly damaging, of course, for Biden and Kamala Harris's election campaign, because in many ways their administration is responsible for these current conditions, and economy is still the number one issue for voters heading into November. So these numbers are potentially going to be very devastating. A lot of economists believe that we are finally headed into the recession that was predicted about 2 years ago, and a lot of people are going to suffer very acutely because of this.
All right, well, that's going to do it for this week. On behalf of Inez, Ben, and Amber, thanks for tuning in. I'm Will Chamberlain. See you at the next NatCon Squad.